we were friends.
So, I know I started this off with Seinfeld, but this is going to be a pretty serious video. We all know what's going on with Danplan right now, especially now that Dan finally said something. This video isn't about prolonging the drama, rather, I'm making this video in hopes that it can result in justice being served. I really gave Dan the benefit of doubt. I eagerly awaited his side of the story, and now I'm beyond disappointed. In this video, I'm gonna deconstruct every video involved in this conflict in order to show you how Daniel pretty much exposed himself in his own response video by admitting to and exemplifying everything that Stephen and Jay accused him of doing, but then attempting to justify his behavior while making himself out to be the victim. Hopefully by the end of this video, some people can have a better understanding of all sides of the story and form their own cohesive conclusion about the issue. So, as it stands, Stephen and Jay both accuse Dan of mistreatment as well as portraying manipulative and exploitative behaviors when regarding his employees, such as Stephen and the animators. Dan not only admits to all of that in his response video, but his behavior and words in the video itself exemplify those accusations. Specifically regarding Dan's video, the things he says in his video prove him to be purely guilty of everything Stephen and Jay said he did. From emotionally abusing and to exploiting his friends, Dan admits to everything but tries to justify it. His attempted defense of the mistreatment and exploitation of his friends, as well as the fact that he tried to make himself the victim, seriously disappointed me as a fan of the channel, but clearly exemplified the kind of stubborn, psychologically manipulative, and detached character that Stephen and Jay had experienced Daniel take on when business is involved. In his response video, Dan gave us, the fans, an insight into the kind of toxic friendship Stephen had to deal with for 9 months after his first confrontation with Dan. And what's worse is that even after watching Stephen's video, Dan still doesn't think he did anything wrong. It goes without saying that no one deserves to feel the way that Dan undoubtedly made Stephen, Jay, and some of the animators feel. That's why I'm so proud of Stephen for being brave enough to stand up for himself and share his story with us. Lately, after Dan's response video was released, a major part of the fandom has taken up the notion that we shouldn't speak on this issue, that we aren't allowed to because apparently it's none of our business. This isn't true. We are fans and supporters of Danplan. We support what's happening behind the scenes of Danplan, whether we know what it is or not. This is very much our business as it is Danplan's business, and I'm glad that Stephen and Jay told us what we were supporting and gave us the means to try and change what is happening. Stephen made this issue public, thus allowing me to speak on it. He made everything public because he had the right to let us know why he had to leave Danplan. He shared his story so he could warn other possible employees about the toxic and deprecating mindset Daniel would have of them that would result in Dan mistreating them like he did Stephen. This was something he explicitly expressed in his leaving video.
This is just a message to any future Danplan 2.0 members. Make sure you know where you stand with Daniel. Whether it be an animator or a personality, make sure you know your worth on the channel. Because Daniel won't.
Finally, Stephen let the public know about this in order to make Dan actually listen to what his friends were trying to tell him in private, hoping that Dan could change how he views and treats others in the company. We can all agree that how Daniel regarded Stephen and how he made Stephen and Jay feel was seriously messed up, and that the contracted amount he pays the animators is not okay. Daniel cannot keep getting away with mistreating and exploiting the people who work for him. In Stephen's livestream and Jay's video, they both explain how they and Hosa tried to talk to Daniel numerous times privately about his mistreatments and unfair wages. But Dan brushed them off, didn't take them seriously, and pretty much told them to F off. After Stephen confronted Daniel, Dan created a relationship that discouraged his employees from questioning how he ran things or even asking for higher wages. I'm inferring that this is why the animators were discouraged from speaking to him about the incredibly low payment he offered them for their work. This and the fact that he would haggle the prices.
We were not passive. Me and Hosa were not passive in this, like, I guess Danplan's development. After our fight, Hosa was still talking to Dan about getting money out to other people, to the animators, to me, to everyone else. But Daniel was so stubborn, and he thinks that his wages are okay. They clearly aren't. I will get into the wage issue after, but it was just not, and Hosa and me were not passive in this.
I told Dan pretty much everything that I found wrong and the ways to improve it. But his argument or rebuttal for a lot of things that I said or that I brought up was that he knew what he was doing. He knew he was in this a lot longer and he's aware of it. And basically he's denied or swept a lot of the crucial bits and pieces of the problem right under. And his reply to my investigation was, to quote him, to quote Dan again, "Jay, from now on, don't ever interfere or dig around in the inner workings of the channel. It's my channel." What he implied with that was basically, he told me to fuck off when I was trying to help him.
So, when it comes to money and business, Dan is not an easy person to speak to. He's so stubborn. He's as stubborn as a rock, and we see that stubbornness throughout his own response video. He defends and defends and defends his actions that have hurt other people. He doesn't acknowledge that his mindset, attitude, and behaviors were hurting the people around him, the people who were supposed to be his friends. Now, Stephen said, "A heavy hand is only moved by a heavier hand," when he was asked if there was any way to have avoided the situation. And he's absolutely correct. The only way to get through to Daniel, to make him actually listen and change his behavior, is to show him that even we, the fans who love him and what he's done for us, the fans who support his company, we do not agree with his mistreating his friends or his toxic mindset when it comes to his employees and the channel. We are the people who support Danplan, so we had to know what was happening behind the scenes and have to show Daniel that what he's doing is not okay. That's why I'm making this video. I'm making this video to show you all and Daniel that what he is doing and trying to defend is not okay. How Daniel treated Stephen and Jay, how he made them feel, is never okay. Under no circumstances anything Daniel did in this situation okay. I do take it as my duty as a fan of Danplan, who cares about the mental, emotional, physical, and financial well-being of Stephen, Jay, Hosa, and the rest of the Danplan community, to speak on this issue and ensure that Dan treats the people who work in his company, who work to make his channel successful, with respect and dignity, and that they are given fair compensation and are rightfully given the acknowledgement and recognition, financially and status-wise, that they deserve. If he chooses not to do this, I will no longer support him or his company, and I implore you to do the same. Before I begin deconstructing Daniel's response video, I want to say this. Dan entirely missed the point of Stephen's leaving video, which is the video he is responding to in the first part of his response video. Dan thinks that this issue, the reason Stephen left, is because Stephen simply wanted more money, or in Dan's words, more compensation. What he cannot seem to understand is that this is not about money. It's about recognition, feelings, and how Daniel unapologetically trampled on Stephen's pride and self-worth while exploiting him for profit.
I didn't want zero recognition, because that's entirely what this was about. Honestly, I didn't care about the money. I still don't care about the money. Like, fuck, sorry, but like, money just ruins friendships. Looking back now, I really wish I had put my foot in the door and said, "What am I, Daniel? To this channel, to you, what am I?"
Also, it seems like a lot of people believe that this conflict is the product of mutual miscommunication and misunderstanding between Dan and Steven. This is not true. I will use other videos that has been made in order to show that this issue did not arise from mutual misunderstanding or miscommunication, but rather from Dan's one-sided misunderstanding and misinterpretation of Steven's words, and that this issue was created entirely because Daniel is much too stubborn to alter the twisted image he has cultivated for Steven in his company. Dan did not make a mistake that he feels remorseful for. Dan himself does not think he did anything wrong. By now, we all agree that Dan fucked up. He deeply hurt his friends, which caused him to lose them and damaged his own company. That is the reality of the situation. Daniel is the one who messed up, but this is not Dan's reality. He makes it very clear in his response video that he most definitely considers and forever will consider Steven as nothing more than a worthless, replaceable, and insignificant part of Danplan, and he sees nothing wrong with this. He considers this image he has of Steven as a fact, and nothing will change his mind about it. And because of this image he has of Steven, he will not acknowledge that he mistreated and exploited his friend. He can't even consider the fact that his attitude and the behaviors that were born from his mindset had hurt his friend. Dan's reality is that he did nothing wrong and that Steven's departure and leaving video was an injustice done unto him. In Dan's head, he is the victim and he is the one that was wronged. He does not understand, even after watching Steven's video, why his now ex-friend ended their business and personal relationship. My deconstruction of Dan's response video, aided by Steven and Jay's videos, will clearly detail our perspectives that have been made public and illustrate that Dan missed the point severely. And he did this due to his toxic stubbornness. So let's begin with Dan's point of view, or rather the mindset he carries concerning Steven in relation to the channel. From the very start of the video, Daniel makes it clear that he never considered Steven as a part of his YouTube venture. He details events that he believes separates himself from Steven when it comes to Joe Worth on the channel.
On May of 2017, Hosa asked if I wanted to do YouTube again. I should have said no. This is because after 2 years of going to university and doing small-time co-op positions, I finally had been offered a dream job at a big company within our industry, and it was one of those once-in-a-time opportunities that I was really appreciative to get, and it probably wouldn't come back again. So I should have been smart and I should have taken that position. However, I said yes because YouTube at that time was my dream. I wanted to make people smile. I loved making videos, even if they weren't getting views. It was a passion of mine. I wanted people to feel how I felt when I watched other YouTubers. So I declined the offer. I said no to the company with that position, and I just did YouTube with Hosa. I gave up a big opportunity for it, and I thought I made a bad decision at the time because it was dumb, but I was passionate about what I wanted to do, so I took the risk. Now this is when Hosa invited Steven. Hosa and Steven have been playing a lot of games together, and Hosa said that Steven's very funny, so we invited him to a couple of our recordings. This is when we started our By the Way series. And at the time, Hosa and I were taking this very seriously. I just passed on a opportunity that was going to help my career, so I was taking it as something that I wanted to make something out of. So we asked Steven if he wanted to take this seriously with us. He answered no. He said he was only recording for fun, that he only does recording even occasionally, and he knows that Hosa and I do most of the work, so he doesn't really want to be part of it, and it's just for fun.
Dan begins his response video by saying that he gave up a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to chase YouTube. He made a sacrifice for YouTube. His sacrifice shows he takes YouTube very, very seriously, and that somehow this fact elevates his importance and relevance to the channels and the channel's success. Giving up the job offer to pursue YouTube is something Dan continuously uses throughout his video to convince us that it makes him more important to the channel than Steven. Dan is telling us that his sacrificing a huge job offer for YouTube, his taking YouTube more seriously than Steven, is what makes him deserve a share and membership status. And because Steven did not give up anything for YouTube, because Steven considers YouTube as a hobby rather than a job, he is not on the same level as Dan and was never a member of the channel from the start. Since Dan never ever considered Steven as a member of Danplan, in Dan's mind, Steven is not deserving of a share to the company. Dan admits to, and as you will soon see, adamantly defends this mindset continuously throughout his response video. Dan also makes it a point to detach Steven from the accounts at the very start of the channel. He details that it was only him and Hosa at first when YouTube was still only a hobby for Dan, because Steven would, as he says, only come by occasionally, and that Steven was not part of it when Dan and Hosa pursued YouTube as a career. Steven declined to pursue it as a job and kept it casual as a hobby. Hosa and Dan are the ones who mutually decided to take YouTube seriously, as Dan says. And to Dan, this means that they are the only unofficial members of Danplan who are deserving of a share. Dan clearly established Steven as an outsider without Steven or Hosa even knowing about it or agreeing to this position. In Dan's mind, because Steven didn't think of YouTube as a job, that resulted in Steven automatically being shut out. And Steven understands that this is how Dan thinks. That's why in his leaving video, he said,
But I kept it casual, which was my biggest mistake. It's no secret that I've never thought of YouTube as anything other than a hobby. Even now with Actually Steven, I still don't consider it a job. But Daniel did.
But then we started to grow. We started to grow as a channel. We got incredibly lucky. The videos that we've been sharing on 9gag and Reddit caught the attention of those users, and we got 10,000, 20,000 views. At the time, that seemed insane. We were ecstatic that people were watching us. When we reached 1,000 subscribers, we thought we made it, and we were happy, and we worked harder than ever. For the rest of that summer, we put all our time and effort into making more videos and running the channel. Hosa was drawing animations, I was writing scripts, I was editing, and just overall running the channel as a channel. It was a good time. Steven was just still coming on occasionally, recording, and then leaving for weeks or months at a time while we did it. But
Dan continues to detach and distance Steven from the channel. Notice Dan's use of we. We refers to him and Hosa. Steven is not included. This is one of the major problems that Steven has with Daniel.
I stayed because I wanted to try to prove to Daniel that I wasn't just an employee, but rather an integral founding member of the channel, and my contribution deserves acknowledgement.
Yet, even in his response video, we can see that Daniel still doesn't acknowledge Steven and continues to downplay and devalue Steven's work. For example, Dan speaks very enthusiastically and highly of the work he and Hosa did. When he talks about the work he and Hosa did, his word choices are very solid. I quote, "Hosa was drawing animations. I was writing scripts. I was editing. His voice is upbeat and vibrant, and he lumps the work he and Hosa performed under the category of running the channel. He leaves Steven's work out, and when he does start talking about the work Steven did, which was recording, providing content that would bring in viewers and make them want to subscribe for more, Dan's tone becomes dulled. He uses choice words to make it seem as though what Steven provided for the channel wasn't as important as Hosa's animation or Dan's editing. Because as a side note, Dan did not write scripts for Steven. Everything Steven did and said in the videos come from his own creativity, his own humor and charm. Just as a side note. So when Dan said, and I quote, Steven was just coming on occasion, the choice word just is a devaluing word when used as it is used in Dan's senses. He adds the phrase on occasion and emphasizes the word leaving in order to distance Steven from him and Hosa. I'm detailing these points because it reveals just how naturally Dan expresses his disparaging view of Steven's role on the channel. It shows us that from the very start, in Dan's mind, Steven never did anything crucial or impactful or essential to the channel and was never part of the channel. Dan makes Steven out to be a guest rather than someone who's been there from the start. Dan talks about the channel's early achievements and how happy they were about it, but by they, he means only himself and Hosa were happy about those achievements. Again, Steven is excluded. He talks about how only him and Hosa were running the channel and putting time and effort into the channel, as though Steven wasn't putting his own time and effort into each recording to make his personas exciting and enjoyable to the viewers. Dan stresses how hard he and Hosa worked and dismisses everything Steven did. Purposely, he leaves Steven out and devalues everything Steven does, and has already established that Steven's role on the channel, what Steven did, was not important to the channel. Of course, we as viewers know this is not true. Steven had an insanely integral role in Danplan's success, and here we see that Dan specifically did not think Steven had any contribution or actual importance to the channel, and he freely expresses this view. So, 6 minutes into the video and we already see the kind of mindset Dan has about Steven's role, impact, and work on the channel. The dismissive language we've now seen Daniel naturally use, that the value Steven's work and presence on the channel is a product of his image of Steven. This is the mindset that Daniel held when Steven confronted him about gaining a share to the channel, and the kind of image of Steven Daniel carried with him when Steven was trying to talk to him about his role and impact on Danplan. Daniel's attitude here is the reason for Steven's emotional turmoil under Danplan and eventual departure.
For the past 9 months, I tried. God knows I tried. Every recording session, I brought my humor, my edge to the table. But I fought a losing battle. The more effort I put into developing my character, developing Steven, I realized how little Daniel valued it. Formal Mafia Steven, Huggy Zombie Apocalypse Steven, Hosa Steven. Daniel didn't give me a script to do those characters. I made them up, and I made my personalities enjoyable. But to Daniel, every recording session, I was merely talking to friends. To him, I wasn't putting in any effort into the videos. Every recording session, I wanted to swear at Daniel for real, to yell at him so much that I had to stop talking sometimes, or else I might say something I would regret the next day. And that feeling only grew each session, until the last recording in November that we did, where I finally just zoned out and stopped trying at all.
For 9 months after Steven confronted Daniel, Steven tried to change the image Daniel had of him by working harder than ever before to cultivate new personalities and charm that brought Daniel's company more views, subscribers, and revenue as a result. But as we see here, just 6 minutes into Dan's response video, Daniel still continues to perpetuate this toxic mindset concerning Steven. Dan still, from day one, views Steven and his role on Danplan as worthless. In his response video, Dan has clearly expressed to us that he believes that Steven's role on Danplan is not an important one. He does not consider what Steven does for the channel as work. And because Steven does not see YouTube as a job, Steven was never part of the channel to begin with. Steven was never a member. It was only Dan and Hosa, and that's the way it's going to stay. Jay's video reveals Dan's mindset towards Steven, which supports Dan's mindset in his response video.
I found out that few years prior to the time of investigation, or yeah, the time of investigation, so 2019, so a few years prior to that, just as the channel was growing, Dan decided himself to split the channel's revenue 50-50 with himself and Hosa. He purposely left out Steven. Now, Dan later reasoned that the reason Steven was left out was that Steven was very uncaring about the YouTube project. The example Dan gave to me was that Steven would be on his phone during the recording. I actually confirmed that with Steven, that it only happened twice, and both occurred during a very long recording session, lasting 4 hours. One with the Hunger Game and one with the Mafia. And Steven would also not do much in terms of the channel with editing, etc. But I'm pretty sure a lot of you Danplan followers might know Steven had an incredibly massive influence at this point. Like, he had a massive audience. The influence that Steven had cannot be ignored. I estimate that at this point, almost, if not over 40% of the channel probably came to see Steven.
Just like the rest of us, Jay understands that Steven's work on a channel, his personas, his charm, his comedy, his creativity, had a huge impact in Danplan's views and subscriber counts. Jay also understands that to the audience, Daniel purposely marketed Steven as an integral member of the channel. Steven was one of the trio in the company's friendship image. So it was confusing as to why Daniel did not consider Steven a member who was deserving of a share to the company he inarguably helped grow. Dan's answer to Jay contains the same dismissive and disparaging attitude towards Steven that Dan has shown in his response video. It is important to understand Dan's mindset and view of Steven because this is the cause of their conflict.
This is when Dan first and foremost fucks up in an ungodly fashion. Dan tells Steven a straight up no, that he gets 0% and that he's just an employee, that he doesn't have a share, nothing more, and that he doesn't deserve a share of the channel. Here's the thing though, Steven's not dumb, and to be honest, he's one of probably the smarter people that I met. He knows his self-value, he knows his worth. The critical mistake that Dan makes at this point wasn't just rejecting the share proposal and then gutting it to 0. It's the implications behind that action. A share has basically two meanings. There's the monetary definition, the money side, and there's the representation of how much you mean to a company. If you have 25% of a company share, you are 25% of a company, and those two things are proportional to each other. Like, if the more you mean to a company, the more monetary benefit that you get. And so Steven knew both of these definitions, and that's why he asked for shares as compensation for his work and for future contributions towards the channel that he helped grow. But for Dan, he had a very different, unconventional definition for shares. For Dan, a share was something precious that only the originals could get. Also, like, I just want to make a note that Dan's definition fluctuates greatly. Yeah. So Dan's definition of share doesn't even revolve around money or business-wise. It's just a special title under a special law. are you an original? No, then you get nothing. That was Dan's mindset. So even if Steven was there when Dan physically made the channel, just by the virtue of Steven not doing enough in Dan's eyes, Steven's original title was withdrawn without even Steven knowing. So when Dan told Steven that he's getting 0%, Dan implicitly told Steven not only that is he worth 0% towards Danplan, that he's not even a percentage worth towards Danplan. He pretty much also told him that he's not even viewed as an original. And by that virtue, Dan was telling an important asset to his company, Danplan, who brings an enormous audience and had an immense potential regarding his charisma, humor, that he was just a member, an employee. Another way to put it is that Dan told Steven that implicitly that he's a disposable unit, an easily replaceable one. So Steven, after being told that he's nothing more than a worthless minion, he got pissed off. And as you can see, this was the outcome for that.
Remember this, because Dan himself will prove this to be true and try to justify it.
As the channel grew, we started making revenue, actual money. It was insane, and when it happened suddenly, and it was something we never really expected. When we started to make money, I told Steven that we want to pay him. He declined, but I insisted that he at least take something for his time of recording with us. So we mutually decided to pay him $25 an hour for his recording times. This is where the $225 came into play.
Dan says when the channel began earning revenue, we noticed the use of we, as in meaning himself and Hosa, wanted to pay Steven as for his time and recording with us meaning Dan and Hosa. I know I'm belaboring this point, but I really need you guys to understand Dan's perspective here. In Dan's mind, Steven is not a part of Danplan. Steven is a guest that is taking time out of his day to assist them on the channel. Dan did not ever view Steven as a part of this channel. He is saying so himself right here. I will replay it.
As the channel grew, we started making revenue, actual money. It was insane, and when it happened suddenly, and it was something we never really expected. When we started to make money, I told Steven that we want to pay him. He declined, but I insisted that he at least take something for his time of recording with us.
Steven was only a guest in Dan's eyes. It is crucial that you all understand this. Daniel treats and refers to Steven as an extra. Steven is not a vital member of Danplan to him. Now that you all understand how Dan viewed and still continues to view Steven, I want you to consider this. Since Steven was never a part of Danplan in Daniel's eyes, why did Daniel market him as one of them? Why did Daniel purposely portray the channel as being owned and run by a trio, him, Hosa, and Steven, rather than a duo as just him and Hosa? When you look at the videos, like the prank videos, the should we sell merch video, the first impressions video, the Discord server video, etc., Dan, the person who edits these videos and uploads them, purposely marketed Steven as a member who had rights to say how the channel would be run. For example, his opinion was considered on whether they would sell merch as a channel or not in the merch video. In the videos, Dan made Steven out to be a crucial and integral part of Danplan.
Dude, it's not cool, man. Like, you know how insecure I am about you guys leaving? I don't see why. Like, you could have picked any prank, man. Like, why would it be about leaving the channel?
Okay, you know that it's not gonna work. We can't leave the channel after everything that's been happening. It's not gonna work. Daniel's gonna be in such a terrible pain, and we're gonna be the dicks if we left.
I mean, even on the merch, Dan takes the personas Steven created and his quotes and sells it for profit. Profit that Steven received none of. Dan purposely markets Steven as an integral, important decision-making, here from the start member, and he makes money off of that. The three best friends image is Danplan's brand, and Dan knows that this brand is the important part of his company that makes his company successful and makes his channel different from other animation channels. So even though Daniel never considered Steven to be a part of the channel or a member, he still marketed Steven as a member and made money off of Steven's work. And as we are about to see, Steven received less than 1% of the revenue he helps generate. And Dan tries to justify this by telling Steven that he is not and never will be a member. He works for Daniel as an employee, and he will be paid the amount of money that Dan thinks Steven deserves. Guys, what Daniel was doing is a clear example of exploitation and manipulation. Remember, once the channel began gaining revenue, Jay found that Daniel had split the channel's revenue 50-50 between himself and Hosa. Daniel purposely left out Steven from the division of shares. Steven did not get a share of the channel. Daniel also did not tell Steven how much money the channel was making. Rather than, while keeping Steven in the dark about exactly how much money he helps generate, told Steven he wanted to pay him now that the channel was making an ambiguous amount of money. Steven, who did not and still does not think of YouTube as a job, declined payments from Daniel, but Dan insisted, and they settled on $25 an hour. What Daniel has done here is the very start of his shady practices and his mistreatment towards Steven. Instead of being transparent about the channel's financial gains and telling Steven that he had split shares with Hosa, instead of acknowledging that the money the channel was making was due to the content of which Steven provided, and realizing that Steven played a huge part in the revenue, thus splitting the channel's revenue between himself, Hosa, and Steven accordingly, Daniel made Steven an employee by giving him, and here's where the manipulation comes into play, by convincing him to take on the wage of $25 an hour while withholding key information about the money and the splitting of shares. Withholding key information is a manipulation tactic. Now, because he accepted getting an hourly wage from Daniel, Steven's role as an employee was established. Steven had no knowledge of how much money he helped make for the company because Daniel purposely kept that from him, and he had no knowledge that Daniel had initially split shares between himself and Hosa.
He will try to, in my head, he'll either try to dispute the money claim, which he usually tries to, oh my god, he tries to exploit people with like their lack of knowledge of the actual money that's being thrown around.
Let me make this clear. Daniel, in his very own video, has expressed in detail that he never ever considered Steven as a member of Danplan. Even with this mindset, Daniel purposely marketed Steven as a vital core member of Danplan and made a lot of revenue off the content Steven provided in their videos. Daniel then split the revenue between himself and Hosa, explicitly leaving Steven out. Daniel did not tell Steven how much money the channel was making off of the videos that Steven worked in, and purposely kept Steven in the dark about splitting the revenue. Finally, he convinces Steven to take on an hourly wage, which would then establish Steven as an employee and Dan as Steven's boss. An unequal power dynamic was established. Guys, this is a clear example of manipulation and exploitation. With this statement that Dan says,
As the channel grew, we started making revenue, actual money. It was insane, and when it happened suddenly. and it was something we never really expected. When we started to make money, I told Steven that we want to pay him. He declined, but I insisted that he at least take something for his time of recording with us. So we mutually decided to pay him $25 an hour for his recording times. This is where the $225 came into play.
Aided by Jay's investigation.
I found out that few years prior to the time of investigation, the time of investigation, so 2019, so a few years prior to that, just as the channel was growing, Dan decided himself to split the channel's revenue 50-50 with himself and Hosa. He purposely left out Steven.
We get a clear picture of how Dan handled the channel's revenue in a shady way. He split shares with Hosa and created a wage for Steven. Dan knowingly manipulated and exploited Steven into being an employee who would receive less than 1% of the revenue he directly helped generate.
From September 22nd of 2018 to February 22nd of 2019, of that 6 months, he worked a total of 9 hours, which was fine. I thought I was compensating something for his time, and he was having fun with his friends and getting some cash out of it. I didn't care if he didn't work a lot. He wasn't taking YouTube seriously.
Right here, Dan uses the manipulation tactic called undermining. Here, Daniel is undermining Steven's work and the worth of his work, when Dan himself knows how much viewers and revenue Steven's work brought into the channel. Daniel, even though he is fully aware of how impactful Steven's persona is to the channel's success, he undermines the reality of this and attempts to convince Steven and the audience that Steven's work was minor and insignificant, which justifies his mistreating Steven. Steven recorded for 9 hours in 6 months, and from those 9 hours, Steven helped generate huge revenue for Danplan, roughly $40,000. Daniel notes how much time Steven worked in those 6 months, but purposely leaves out how much money the channel made in those 6 months from the content that Steven's work provided in their videos. He makes it seem like Steven is detached from the views and subscribers the channel got in those 6 months. Dan says, and I quote, "Of those 6 months, he worked a total of 9 hours." And then he pauses, to make it seem as though Steven barely did anything for the channel in those 6 months. This is yet another example of how naturally Dan undermines and devalues Steven's contributions to the channel. Those 9 hours Steven worked had a huge impact in getting the channel to 1 million subscribers and getting the channel millions of views. And Daniel knows this. He knows this because he continued to market Steven for profit, even though we see here that he undermines Steven's actual importance. This is a direct example of Daniel manipulating and exploiting Steven. Dan knows how popular Steven's character is amongst the viewers. He knows that the content Steven gave the channel was popular, and Dan did not hesitate to market the fuck out of Steven and make huge profits from Steven's work. But what Dan does not understand is that the money the channel made from those 9 hours of work Steven did is just as much Steven's money as it is Dan and Hosa's. Dan does not understand this, nor does he want to understand this, because he has an extremely disparaging image of Steven. Throughout his response video, Dan makes it very clear to us that Steven's work was not worth anything, because Steven did not do enough in Dan's eyes, and because Steven did not personally see what he was doing as a job. As Dan says, Steven was, and I quote, "having fun with his friends," end quote. This is Dan explaining his point of view. It being that he personally does not view what Steven did as work, and that Steven doesn't take YouTube seriously. This then gives Dan the go-ahead to shut Steven out of the company that he is being used in for profit. Dan makes it clear that he never viewed Steven and will never view Steven as an integral member of the channel. To Dan, Steven was just a friend who showed up to record sometimes and got compensated for his time. So here, Dan attempts to justify exploiting Steven for profit because he personally believes that Steven did not deserve a share of the revenue that his work helped generate. What Dan has said thus far is that Steven never had a truly important role in Danplan. He wasn't doing something that nobody else could do. Steven wasn't irreplaceable. Anyone could fill Steven's shoes. Steven wasn't vital for the channel's success, and Steven had little to no impact on the channel's success. This is what Daniel is implying with his explanations and his attitude towards Steven's role on the channel, and how he tries to justify paying Steven less than 1% of the money that Steven clearly had a major part in making. To Dan, Steven didn't do much work, and he continues to repeat that Steven wasn't taking YouTube seriously. And so, the $225 that Steven was paid for 6 months of work was perfect compensation for Steven's time, as Dan says. Now, Dan's mindset is appreciated, but it is not reality. The reality of the situation is that in those 9 hours Steven worked, he brought in 1 million subscribers and millions of views. In those 9 hours Steven worked, he put hundreds of thousands of dollars into Dan's bank account. Daniel is trying to convince us and Steven that Steven's work on the channel had next to no worth or influence on the channel's growth and success during those 6 months. Steven understands Dan's point of view, and he rightfully does not agree with it.
It was no secret that I didn't do as much work as Daniel or Hosa. We even made a video about our roles on Danplan. But to say that I contributed less than 1% to our success is absolutely arrogant, Daniel. And so I confronted him about this.
And Steven had every right to confront Daniel about this. Listen, guys. Dan's negative image of Steven does not change the fact that Steven had a major part to play in views, subscribers, and traffic on the channel. Dan believes that the money the channel made was never Steven's in the first place, which is factually incorrect and shows just how disconnected Daniel is from the reality of his company. Danplan would not be as successful as it is now without the content that Steven provided in each video.
When I got on the call, instead of talking about VidCon or Disneyland, him and another associate of his was on the other line. Steven has said that he heard from Hosta that we were making more money now. So I said yes.
I want to point out the manipulation tactic that Daniel has admitted to here, withholding information. This manipulation tactic was at constant play between Dan and Steven, as we've seen previously. According to Dan, it was Hosa who told Steven that the channel was making more money. Dan purposely withheld that information from Steven, just like he purposely withheld that he created shares to the channel between himself and Hosa. This is only one out of many times that Dan psychologically manipulated and knowingly exploited Steven by withholding this information from him and continuously paying him low wages when compared to the large revenue Steven brought in for the company and when compared to how much of that revenue was going to Dan and Hosa only. Dan did not tell Steven anything about the company which Steven was a part of. He didn't even care to talk to Steven about it friend to friend, outside of business. When they first started getting revenue, Dan said he insisted that Steven get paid something. So, one would think that when the channel started to make a lot more money, then, as a friend, Daniel would at least adjust how much Steven would get paid, or talk to Steven about having a share in the channel, just like he did with Hosa. But Dan just kept Steven in the dark about how much money the channel was making and about him dividing shares. That's shady. Dan kept Steven out because Dan did not see any worth in Steven's role on the channel. This behavior towards Steven and mindset of Steven that Dan has is what caused Steven to be deeply hurt and is what resulted in this conflict between them.
And so I thought we were good because we were friends. I gave him gifts and I invited him to things that I would only invite friends to. Even if he didn't reciprocate, it didn't matter because I wanted us to be friends.
Dan is using the manipulation tactic called guilt tripping and shaming.